Okay, because it is confusing, or can be, I wanted to talk through the whole FMS, FMC, autopilot, autoflight thing, because people do get confused about it. But it is just a combination of individual parts which have been brought together under the umbrella of the flight management system. So, to start from scratch, if you were going to fly the aircraft, you'd need some instruments. So the PFD and ND obviously accomplish that. Primarily, of course, the PFD, the primary flight display, which has all your basic instruments, including a compass at the bottom. So you could fly the aircraft just using a PFD, visual flying, maybe a bit of instrument flying if necessary, and of course you'd be controlling the throttles and you'd be controlling the control surfaces. But the next step up from that, of course, would be to have a system which would help you to fly the aircraft. So what we can do is we can put in the flight director system, which comes under the FD computer, which is in the flight control computer. So flight control computer is flight director and autopilot. Now that makes sense, because what the flight director is going to get you to do is it's going to get you to fly the aircraft by following these, in this case, these crossbars. If the horizontal bar goes up, you fly up, and if the vertical bar goes left or right, you roll left or right, and your aim is to get the bars smack in the middle. But now what have you told the aircraft you want to do? That's down to the control panel at the top. So first of all, you've got to switch on the flight director, and if you have, then the flight director is going to look to see what modes you've selected on this panel. So you can see that information is going to go into the auto flight and direction system to the flight director, depending on whether you've pressed heading or a speed or an altitude or whatever it is you're after, even LNAV and VNAV. But a lot of the time, of course, this was used for approaches for the localizer and the glide slope. So if you press the approach button, then the system is going to look for the localizer glide slope beams, and once it can capture those, then on the FMA, which is possibly one of the most important parts of the whole system, the FMA will show, when you press the approach button up here, that the aircraft is now looking for, or so far the flight director is looking for, the localizer and glide slope. Until we capture those, then we won't be on the correct approach to the airport. So we'll possibly select a heading, just fly towards the localizer and intercept the localizer. So that's the runway centerline dealt with. And then at the right height, we'll approach the airport, we will intercept the glide slope from below, and then we'll fly down the glide slope. Now the flight director can get us to do that. The flight director can guide us to find and fly down the correct approach path to the runway. We're still going to have to manually land, we're still doing the throttles, we're still doing the gear and flaps. Okay, all we've done is introduce an auto flight system which enables us to fly in, in poor visibility really, and find our way down to the runway, down to decision height, which is where we're going to make a decision whether we land or not, or whether we can see the runway or not. The obvious next step is to have an autopilot. So here we have on the mode control panel, we have our autopilot control buttons, and we go back to the AFDS, the auto flight and direction system, and we can see we've now got two autopilots in here as well as the two flight directors. So what I can do now, of course, is I can engage my autopilot to do exactly the same thing that the flight director is trying to tell me to do. So rather than me fly the aircraft, I'm going to get the autopilot to do it. Now I haven't pressed any extra buttons up here other than engage and autopilot. So whatever modes I see on the FMA, what's happening now is, of course, that instead of you having to fly them, or me, the pilot, having to fly them, then the autopilot does that. And I can confirm, I can cross-check that the autopilot is doing the right thing by monitoring the flight director. Clearly we have to monitor everything, we have to make sure our altitude speed is still correct, but assuming it is, then the flight director should be showing us what's going on. So we've had the instruments, the pilot flying, the flight director coming in to help the pilot flying, and now we've got the autopilot. So now we can sort of relax a bit more because the autopilot is going to take a lot of the load off us. We still haven't brought in the auto thrust system, so let's do that now. Now let's say, okay, so we're using the autopilot to fly us to an altitude using, let's say, flight level change, but we had to set the climb thrust. Now if I bring in an auto thrust system, then when I press things like takeoff, I can use the computers to tell the auto thrust system, oh look, I've pressed the toga button, and the auto thrust system will go, okay, we're on the ground, I need to select takeoff thrust. And that takeoff thrust, of course, will have been decided usually by the FMC. So this is where the FMC starts to come in, because I've put information into the FMC. It knows the performance of the aircraft, it knows my weights, it knows the temperature outside. I've given it all the information necessary. So the FMC is going to send a setting out to the auto thrust system, and of course it's also going to set the bugs on the engine indication system, so the ECAS or ECAM. There's going to be a bug, green bug, showing me where the thrust is going to go to when I ask the auto thrust system for that. Okay, so having pressed the toga button on takeoff, I get takeoff thrust, and in the climb it will revert to climb thrust if that's what I'm asking for. So let's say I'm not doing LNAV or VNAV yet, I'm just selecting flight level change. So as I climb out, flight level change will look for the height that I've selected in my height window, and it will also look to see whether that height is above or below me. So if that flight level is above me, obviously I'm climbing out, then it will tell the auto thrust system, oh, I'm climbing, or we're climbing, so you need to select climb thrust. And that's what will happen. In flight level change, the auto thrust system will select a climb thrust, and the autopilot will look to see what speed I've selected in this window, and it will tell the autopilot to fly that speed. So this is really safe climbing and descending, because if the autopilot is controlling the speed in pitch, I can't overspeed or underspeed. You know, I can't overspeed or stall, because the aircraft won't allow that to happen. It will pitch down if the speed becomes too slow, and it will pitch up if the speed becomes too fast. So that's the beauty of flight level change. It will control the speed on the autopilot, so if my thrust varies a little with altitude or with engine performance, I'm safe. Okay, so we've now got the flight director, which shows me everything's going fine, assuming the autopilot's okay. I've got the autopilot, which is flying the aircraft on the flying control surfaces. I've got the auto throttle now doing the engine thrust, so it's looking to see what I've pressed up here, and if it's relevant to the auto throttle, then it will do something. If it's relevant to the autopilot, which of course it usually is, it will do something. So let's introduce the LNAV and VNAV buttons now, because we've got everything we need. We just haven't really taken into account the nav database and anything that I've put in here, apart from the auto thrust setting. So when we go to the CDU of the flight management computer, so this is still all part of the FMS, of course, but the FMC is the flight management computer, and the CDU is what they call the human machine interface between you and the FMC. So there is already information in the FMC, the nav database, the performance database, that's already in there. Nav database, remember, is replaced every 28 days. You'll have two nav databases, the new one and the old one, just in case. So when you go to the CDU and you put in where you are, which helps to initialize the IRS, you put in where you're going to, so you've got your route started, you put in your departures and your arrival, standard arrivals, you put in the temperature that you want the aircraft to think it is if you want to do a derated or flex takeoff, you put in your winds, and this all helps the FMC to work out the best lateral and vertical route profile for you. So you're going to save fuel, you're going to climb efficiently. Okay, this is all why you have an FMC and why you program it. Now you can of course put in a cost index, and that's one of the main things really, because when you put a low cost index in, the system does its best to save you fuel. This means it's going to take longer to get somewhere, but you will save money and you will save fuel. If, for instance, you were late off chocks, say an hour, and you've got a 6-hour flight, now it's quite possible that you could possibly catch up that time simply by putting in a high cost index and getting to your destination on time, which means you're not going to have passengers delayed, misconnecting flights, that sort of thing. So when you program the CDU, you're telling the FMC what it is how you want to achieve what it is you're after, how you want to fly your route, and you're giving the systems information that they're going to need to either guide you using the flight director, because that is still possible, although not usual of course, but that information will also go into the AFDS in pitch and roll mainly, and whatever the LNAV and VNAV route profiles tell the Autopilot to do and the auto throttle to do, then they will do that. So for instance, if you were following a VNAV path, which would be a particular gradient between two waypoints, then the FMC would have told the Autopilot, right, I need you to follow this path. So Autopilot, I need you to stay on this vertical track effectively. And what will happen during that vertical path climb would be that the FMC would be telling the auto throttle system, oh, by the way, we're in VNAV path, can you look after the speed for me, please? And that speed would be coming from the FMC. So whenever you're in LNAV and VNAV, quite often you'll find that the speed window is blank, simply because the speed is not coming from the mode control panel, it's coming from the FMC. Now, how do you know that? As always, you go to the FMA. The FMA shows you exactly what you have and maybe what's armed, but it shows you what's engaged. So if we look at the left-hand window on the FMA, the auto throttle window, we would see FMC speed, and in the vertical pitch window on the FMA, we'd see VNAV path. Of course, in the lateral window, the roll window, we'd see LNAV, because we've selected LNAV and VNAV. So, by programming via the CDU, the human machine interface, by programming the FMC, giving it the information it needs, we've allowed the auto flight and control system, the auto thrust and autopilots, we've allowed that, as long as we press the buttons telling them what we want, we've allowed that to fly the aircraft on a lateral and a vertical profile. Thrust is being dealt with automatically. Okay, there's nothing we need to do, and that's basically it. We've got a control panel, we have full control over everything. We can switch off autopilots, we can switch off the flight director, we can disable modes anytime we want to. We can intervene, we can go into altitude hold, heading hold, whatever it is we want to do. But it's very important that we monitor the FMA, make sure that the engaged modes are what we want, that we monitor on the navigation display our route, not only laterally but vertically. So we may need to be checking on the CDU, we may need to be looking at the legs and seeing what our vertical profile is. Remember that using the EFIS controllers, you can ask the ND to show the altitude for your next waypoints on the screen. Okay, so by pressing the data button on the EFIS controllers, you can actually see more information on the navigation display. So that might save you having to go into the CDU to do that. So I hope that's helped. Just remember that the FMS is everything that we see on this screen, and it includes the autopilot, the flight director, the auto thrust system, and the FMCs and CDUs. It's just a generic name for the whole thing. And the control panel here is what allows us to effectively tell the system what it is we want. Do we want nothing, or do we want everything? Do we want the full LNAV, VNAV package? You can override any of this at any time. You can switch it off at any time. You decide what you want. It is not down to the FMC or the FMS to tell you what to do unless you ask it to. Okay. Remember, you're always in charge of this system. Okay, thank you.